Okay, yeah. So my presentation is on SAFEs. SAFEs stand for Simple Agreement for Future Equity. I'm just going to go over some of the purposes, kind of how the SAFE was born, the trends, things like that. So what is a SAFE? Basically, a SAFE is a popular method, seed funding created by Y Combinator. This is a firm out of Silicon Valley that started the type of seed funding around 2013. So essentially, investors send money at an early period of a startup for the right to own stock in later rounds of funding, usually in Series A funding. And the big thing is that SAFEs are convertible securities, not debt. And I'll go to why that is relevant. Okay, so I think it's helpful to think about SAFEs in comparison to convertible notes because they both happen at relatively the same time of a startup. And it kind of gives you a good contrast to why they're different. So convertible notes are far more complex agreements, contractual agreements between firms and investors, and they're debt. So a investor sends money to a firm, and there's a maturity date where the firm or the startup has to essentially pick three options. They can apply to postpone the maturity date to a later period, maybe when they have more cash to pay back the debt. They can straight buy out the debt plus the interest that's accrued on the convertible note. Or they can just give up the agreed upon equity at the start of the transaction. So convertible notes, they're structured as debt, they have interest, and there's a maturity date with basically where a decision has to be made. So why do we use SAFEs instead of convertible notes? Essentially, the Y Combinator firm that kind of started the SAFE wanted an easier way to get funding to these startups. SAFEs are around 5-page documents, much smaller than convertible notes. Also, it's helpful to push back the valuation on early startups because there's limited data in terms of how the business is doing, how they're going to project in the future, things like that. So you can't really get an accurate valuation on the company. So these investors created the SAFE just to kind of push back to when you get more an accurate valuation. And with a convertible note, there's a threat of insolvency for the startups at the maturity date if they don't have the liquidity to pay back the whole debt plus interest, which puts a lot of pressure on the startup and can really negatively affect the growth of the company. So it just essentially removes that threat because SAFEs are not structured as debt. And also for a startup, the legal fees and the time it takes to negotiate and kind of get the whole deal figured out is very cumbersome and takes a lot of time. And for these younger companies, paying lawyers and these legal fees is has an extreme negative effect on just the growth of the company. So with SAFEs, because they're so simple, they kind of just get rid of that. So I'm just going to go behind kind of like the math of a normal SAFE interaction with no terms, and then we'll get to some of the terms later. So the amount of shares allocated to the safe investor is based on a future round of funding and the valuation on the company in a future round of funding. So we'll just go kind of over like this, a simple scenario. So let's say a safe investment is $50,000, and then a few years later, there's a $450,000 equity investment at a $5 million valuation, right? So they issue 500,000 shares and $10 per share. So how it works is essentially the founder takes 450,000 of the shares because the valuation is at 5 million. The safe investor gets 5,000 because of the $5 million valuation. 50,000 of their investment is only 1% of the company. And then the equity investor gets 9% at 45,000 shares. If any of this is not making sense, just feel free to let me know, and I can kind of explain it in a different way. So there are some terms that kind of go along with the safes that are a lot more common than just a normal, simple safe. So the first one is called a discount, and a discount basically allows the investor to recoup a reduced price per share. Your average discount on these safe deals is 10 to 30%, and we'll kind of go into what that looks like in a little bit. There are also valuation caps. So this basically sets a limit on the valuation of a company can receive from the future round of funding, and that lowers the share price that the investor then gets after. Also, there are two things that don't really affect the amount of shares or the share price, but are also really notable to understand within safe deals. So the most favored nation provision is basically startups can have multiple safes layered on top of each other, and the startup is, if they do have multiple safes kind of layered on top of each other at different times, the previous safes have to be informed, and they have to be offered the same quality of deal that the future or the next safe deal was at. And then there's also things called pro rata rights. So the safe investors have the right to maintain equity in the company in a future round of funding. So the safe deal will happen, and then during a future round of funding, Series A or something like that, the if any dilution of the equity of the company for the safe investor happens, they're able to kind of invest again in an equal amount to maintain their equity, their percent in the company.
So Dylan, before you move on, can I add a little bit of context for those that are less familiar with deal rounds and valuations and how we allocate out percentages?
Yeah, go ahead.
So if you could back up the one before this. So for those of you that have less perspective here, typically when a transaction takes place, let's say a venture capital transaction, if I'm the venture capitalist, I'm putting in, say, $500,000 of my money into a company. When we do that, we're going to have valued the company first. and then my $500,000 will become part of this overall number. So let's say the company is valued at $2 million. I'm giving 500,000 in. That means I've contributed an amount equal to 25% of the overall value. This is, by the way, would be called a post-money value. So I've contributed 25% of this. So that means I get 25% of the shares that are available for the company. So that's a very simplified way of looking at a typical transaction. I think what you're telling me, though, is a SAFE has almost the opposite effect. I might put in, and now I'll come down to the kind of dollars you're dealing with here, I might put in my $50,000, but at the time that I put it in, we don't know the value of the company. We just know that I put my $50,000 in. And at a point in time, when the company does obtain a valuation, then we determine what percentage of overall ownership, adjusted for the discounts you just referenced, what percentage of the overall ownership I'm going to get because of having given my 50,000. Is that what you're trying to tell us?
Yeah, that is what I'm trying to say. Maybe I didn't articulate it in the best manner, but
you articulated just fine. I just want to make sure that everybody had the context and the perspective a little bit deeper reaching than what you were looking at.
Yeah, and that kind of deal structure is super interesting because a lot of times from my research, the investor doesn't know exactly what percent equity they're going to get in the company, but they kind of have like this notion that they might get a certain percent based off conversations with the startup CEO or something like that. And then at a later date, after more safes have been issued and after a higher valuation has happened, they end up actually owning a lot less than they thought. And it can kind of get into some sticky situations for the startup and investors. Okay, so let's go over just kind of what a 10% discount would look like for the same exact deal. So we have 50,000 initial safe investment, same thing, and then also the 450,000 equity investment at the same valuation, $5 million. The share price is the same, but because the investor has a 10% discount, they're going to get 5,555 shares instead of just 5,000. And then the founder eats that those shares and gives up the shares to the safe investor. And again, it's all based off of the valuation of the company. So relatively, the investors kind of want a lower valuation. In my opinion, they want a lower valuation, so they get a larger percentage of the company. Okay, now we'll kind of look at the valuation cap and how that works. Essentially, they're pretty similar, but they're pretty similar in terms of how many shares that the safe investor gets and how many shares that the founder has to give over. So same deal structure, but we have a $4 million valuation cap. So basically, per share, or the safe investor would get the amount of shares if the valuation was 4 million instead of 5 million. So instead of getting 5,000, they get 6,250, 1.25% stake instead of just a 1% stake. And then the founder eats that, gives up those amount of shares. And valuation caps can go a lot higher, whereas discounts kind of, you kind of understand at the start how much, or the founder has a better idea of how much they're going to have to give up in terms of equity after the valuation happens. Okay, so there are some serious downsides to SAFE in terms of, I was reading some articles that talked about how it's really terrible for the founders to not know how much equity they hold in terms of it. They're not doing kind of the dilution math that goes along with these deals. and safes can kind of build on top of each other, and it can get really murky in terms of how much the founder realizes they are going to have to give up. So if you push off evaluation, like I said, the founder doesn't really know how much stock they are going to own. And like I just talked about, the founder can almost falsely promise an amount of equity to the safe investor. And then after the valuation happens, the investor can get extremely angry because they end up owning a lot less, or sorry, owning a lot less of the company than they thought because of the high valuation. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense. Also, safes can be used to postpone the pricing equity until a higher valuation on the company, which is kind of dangerous. And too many of these safes layered on top of each other can turn away primary investors or VC firms because too much of the company has already been given up to these safe investors. I was reading some opinion pieces on how safes need to be kind of more regulated in terms of limits on how many safes can happen for one startup and things like that, just to kind of minimize these downsides for both parties. Okay, so some of like the outcomes, basically the two outcomes of the safe deal is a company can fail before a Series A investment happens, and the company has to pay. This is actually kind of a little bit what I got confused upon on the readings. I was really trying to find an answer for this question. I read a Medium article that Rick posted in the files for that said that the company was obligated to pay back what they could to the safe investor, but I also read tons of things that said they weren't debt structured. So maybe if we can kind of talk about that after the presentation is over, or simply the money is converted into stock during Series A or primary investment. So just kind of some of the stats, because Y Combinator, the firm that created this investment, is out of Silicon Valley. It's kind of the epicenter for this type of investment, and it's slowly growing to other parts of the country and other parts of the world, but primarily it's in the deals primarily happen in percentage-wise in Silicon Valley. So we can see this graph down here. The safe deals have increased every year percentage-wise every year since 2013, all the way up to 80% through Angel List. That's just one website. But overall, only 1.6%. So there's this angel funders report that basically talked about the types of deals and how these startups kind of get funded. And only 1.6% of the Canadian and American angels opted to fund through SAFE, compared to 44% for the normal convertible note. So it's definitely more of a Silicon Valley deal, and basically it's growing. It's growing out of Silicon Valley, but it hasn't reached primary deal structure for most angel investors. All right, so that's my presentation. They're my sources. If anyone has any questions.
Well, very good, Dylan. I believe, Henriette, you're the discussant here. So if you want to moderate our Q&A and maybe even ask Dylan some questions or comments on your own.
Yeah, I didn't quite know how much you were going to cover, and you covered a lot. So most of the questions I wrote down is more or less a summary. So we can try to see if the other ones can answer first, and then you can
I
answer
have a,
the others. How does that sound?
I have actually a two-part question. The first
Okay.
question is, how close would you say that a safe agreement is to a convertible bond?
They're pretty close in terms of what the deal looks like. It's just the big distinction is that it's not structured as debt, and there's no interest that's being accrued upon upon the principal of the loan, right? And another important thing is that there's no maturity date, right? So the value when the valuation happens for next round of funding, that's when the shares get allocated, right? Whereas in a convertible note or convertible bond, right, there's a specific date where the money has to be converted into shares or paid back in terms of the principal plus interest. And with the safe, it's not like that. It's based off the event happening, not the date happening.
So I would add to that the primary difference is in the liquidation preference or the liquidation priorities. So a convertible bond or something that's an evidence of debt is going to have preference or priority if and when liquidation takes place, either through failure or successful exit.
Yeah.
But this, I think, comes to the question that you had a minute ago, Dylan, as to the references you saw that the founders or the company had a responsibility to pay back to the safe holders as much as they could. So Jens, you know more about these than I do, I think. I have my own opinion about that. Do you have any comment with respect to that?
Yes, I do. So a safe is a convertible debt instrument, but it doesn't pay any interest. And I think you covered that also. So if you use a safe note, you're not guaranteed any return on it. So your return lies in the business getting to a next stage of funding and that funding round triggering your conversion into equity. If the business doesn't get to another funding round, you are not guaranteed even to get that equity. So you're taking the risk on that side.
Yeah, I just want to show you real quick the Medium article that basically said, so what if the company fails? This is just one of the things. This is why I kind of got confused in terms of most of the other articles talked about how it is not debt and there's no obligation to pay back. But this one says if company fails, whatever money left, whatever liquidity the company has will be returned. So I was kind of, confused on that portion just because of the slight conflicting information.
So, go ahead.
I think that depends on the agreement, but usually you're not guaranteed any money back on a safe note. And I wanted to ask you also a question, Dylan. I think you did a great job showing the difference between a discount and a valuation cap. And can you explain if there's a larger divergence between the valuation cap and the actual valuation? What does the founder have to do?
So can you rephrase the question a little bit? So if there's a larger, like instead of like a 20% difference, if it's larger, is that what?
Yeah. So I'm the investor. I'm giving cash to the business and in return I get a safe, and then we get to the next funding round, and then the founder is trying to raise cash from a growth fund because they're trying to get good partners that can take the business or advise the business to the next stage. And to get that growth fund on board, you have to offer that fund a large portion of the equity. But then the valuation so let's pretend that the growth fund is leading that round, so they do all the valuation and stuff. So they decide on the valuation, and that's way higher than the valuation cap. So what happens then? Who takes the hit on the dilution side? If the
So
growth
good
fund...
question. The founder takes the hit from the dilution side. They are the ones that have to essentially give proportionally in terms of the difference between the valuation cap and the actual valuation, those proportional shares to the safe investor. And I also forgot to mention in the presentation, safe agreements can have both discounts and valuation caps, and they can kind of work in combo to get a very good deal for the safe investor.
What would you prefer, Dylan? Would you prefer to give the investor a discount or a valuation cap in the agreement?
It really depends on how confident I would be in. It really depends on like the percent versus the valuation cap, and how confident I would be in if I think if I'm going to bet that my company is going to gain and it's going to have a very large valuation, a valuation much higher than the cap that was talked about, I would definitely prefer a discount. But if I was thinking that the valuation cap was going to be pretty similar to what the actual valuation was going to be, then I would definitely go for the valuation cap instead of the discount.
Great answer. Thanks.
Well, so guys, good discussion. Thanks to both of you.